Hello, welcome everyone back to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am Jesse Collings, joined as always with my co-host, Jason Ounpraseuth. Jason, how are things going for you today?
Yeah, it's going pretty well. Did some I just did some basic research for this episode, and it's very interesting to look at the roster pages for some of the official, at least for the big companies. It's always interesting to say, "Oh, I totally forgot this person is still in WWE," or for AEW, it's like, "Oh, I guess this person warrants roster inclusion," and so I'm sure we'll get to that later on. But yeah, it's always interesting to see. Yeah, similar to who gets the this person's all elite graphic. Yeah, it's interesting to see who makes it to the roster page in some of these big companies.
Yeah, the roster pages, I don't know, they kind of vary on accuracy sometimes,
Yeah,
especially the
exactly.
WWE one, because some people in NXT are on the page, like the people that are in NXT, like are going to be on the page. Like it's not a surprise that Braun Breaker is on the NXT page, but some of those other ones are a little bit different. And you never know who they have, and you just almost forget who they sign because they've signed so many talent over the years. Like, oh yeah, that person who like I heard about on the Indies for a second, and then they were signed by WWE. They're still there, with the turnover and stuff like that. But yeah, what I wanted to talk about was kind of looking at the various ways that Japanese and Japanese trained talent have found their way into American wrestling, and kind of the impact that we're seeing, especially now that the pandemic is far from over, but less of a concern when it comes to international travel, and kind of the various ways that we are seeing it come forth. And I guess I'll start by making this point, Jason. A few years ago, it was all about New Japan Pro Wrestling in the United States, and New Japan coming over to the United States and having New Japan shows. And that still obviously happens. But a lot of people would say, and we've said on this podcast, that New Japan is not as prominent in the United States as it once was due to a variety of factors. But what we see now is not, it's what's bigger than ever, what seems like it's bigger than ever, is just the general interest and fascination with Japanese pro wrestling across the board, not just New Japan talent that's from other companies, talent from joshi promotions, and the kind of various influences that they're finding in the United States in pretty much every single promotion that you can think of, whether it's AEW, WWE, and the independents. And I'm really interested, particularly in the independents, because that shows a level of grassroots organic interest that in these wrestlers from smaller promotions. And they're able to carve out a foothold and have like these little like tours where they come to America and they wrestle for all these indie groups. And it's not like Hiroshi Tanahashi is doing it. It's not like or even like someone like Minoru Suzuki, who I think has kind of almost emerged as a pioneer, being like a Japanese legend coming over and doing indie tours. But other talent, we've seen a lot of Kanasuke Takeshita. We've seen like I always mispronounce his name, Shingehiro Irie.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard his name said too much, but I know what you're talking about.
But you see like these kind of these known Japanese independent
Yep.
wrestlers popping up more and more in wrestling in America. It seems like we're at a different stage of the Japanese wrestling in the United States, and kind of the impact that it's had. And despite the pandemic, and despite maybe New Japan not being quite as dominant in the United States as it once was, seems like it's stronger than ever, and that interest is there across the board in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just I bring up that roster discussion because Yuka Sakazaki, she has warranted a spot on that AEW roster page, despite making very sporadic appearances on AEW, and most of the time she's on Dark. I think once in a while they'll put her on television, um, and yeah, not only just her, but you know like we mentioned, just briefly, off air, Miyu Yamashita, or she'll be, I guess, mostly doing West Coast, indies as well that she's been booked for. And Tokyo Joshi Pro, it's part of that DDT umbrella, but still, I would still mostly associate Stardom as being the one Joshi promotion that most people know. But I think you're seeing a lot more. Maybe this is that reason that's bringing talents like Miyu Yamashita, Yuka Sakazaki, even Maki Ito has made appearances on AEW television, and she's garnered a huge internet following. Bringing them along helps give that promotion, Tokyo Joshi Pro, a lot more eyes on its product. Again, like we don't really know the numbers on this, like whether are people subscribing to Wrestle Universe a lot more because they are seeing these DDT or Tokyo Joshi Pro wrestlers on American television. You would presume so, but at least the public profile of these wrestlers are getting boosted because they are just in the American atmosphere of maybe not these mega indies, but at least some prominent indies that people have a vague awareness of.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think if we want to talk about the women's talent in particular, especially them making indie dates, and especially their use in AEW, although that is kind of, I think, declined over the years since AEW first started, was we live in a world wrestling landscape now where there's a great demand for women's wrestling, but there's a limited amount of women's wrestlers. And I've talked about this with some people before, some people that are involved in wrestling schools and stuff. And I've asked, like, oh, you must have a bunch of more women students, coming out and want to wrestle because women's wrestling is so more prominent, on major national television shows. And they've kind of said, no, it's kind of the same. We have mostly guys, a few women here and there, but it's not like there's this big turnout. So when the fans have a demand for women's wrestling, is there a talent supply in the United States that can meet that demand? And is there a talent supply that can be good enough to justify being on a card? And that can be tough for a lot of promoters to find. And so where are there a lot of, veteran, talented, well-trained women's wrestlers? They're in Japan. And so I feel like that's one of the things that you see coming across, a lot of these indie promotions and especially, in AEW, especially when AEW is first getting started, you'll see them lean on Joshi talent in a way that they, maybe wouldn't have had to do if there wasn't this big demand for women's wrestling and high quality women's wrestling.
Yeah, that was like I'm sure that was a test for their new audience, since AEW, like in the early stages, was kind of just throwing like a bunch of different names out of the bat, especially with their casino battle royals. They brought in many different talents, like I remember Jordan Grace. I think she was in one of those battle royals, and start testing her out. And I remember B Priestley, before she signed NXT UK, they brought her along, and she had some roots in Joshi as well, Stardom. And I think the most prominent sign of this for the indies is PWG actually is going to have a women's match and one of their upcoming cards. It's Masha Slamovich against Yuka Sakazaki. And I think people are pointing out that it's a women's match, but I would just more point out that it's more of a Joshi match more than anything else, because Masha Slamovich has, some history in Joshi wrestling, in the Joshi world, having wrestled in Japan for mostly a year. I remember 2020, she mostly wrestled in Japan, obviously due to the pandemic. But she has experience in that style of wrestling. And so I think that's the big part there for PWG having a women's match. And it kind of reminds me of sort of like the early days of Ring of Honor, when they would bring in guys like Kenta, Misawa, all the Noah guys back in the day. And that was more catering towards the tape trader crowd, because that was that sort of that perfect generation of guys who watch, a Misawa, a Kenta Kobashi, just through tape trading, just on video cassettes. And so we've sort of evolved from that towards more streaming, because that's mostly the only way you can watch any of these shows is through these company streaming services, at least in a legal sense anyway, or the YouTube clips that they would release. And so I think that's sort of the evolution we're seeing now in terms of bringing international talent into the United States.
Yeah, the PWG match is a good point, and I was going to bring it up as well. I think it's PWG's first singles match between two women in I think like since 2010 or something like that.
Yep.
They had Candice LeRae as kind of like a token woman, and she did a lot of tag team work with Joey Ryan and different mixed wrestling matches and stuff like that. But this is a straight up no frills women's match, I think, for the first time they've had in well over a decade. And obviously, okay, you have, so why didn't they have that for a long time? And a lot of people will point to, Super Dragon, who books PWG, maybe not having a very uncharitable view of women's wrestling in general. But PWG was always promotion where it's like, we're going to try to deliver the best matches. We're going to scour the world to find the best talent that we can bring in. And it's super serious. And if you have to be really good, and if you don't do that, you're not going to get booked back, and it's going to look bad for the promotion. There are supposed to be no duds in PWG. And if you looked at, they're not going to book the Alley Cat or Alley Catch on their show because they're not doing that kind of style of wrestling. So this is kind of them breaking out. And what do? They find Masha Slamovich, who is probably the best American women unsigned wrestler at this time. People can have different opinions on that, but clearly a top tier women on the independents at this moment. And they're going in and they're bringing in a joshi talent, Yuka Sakazaki, who's, in the United States because she works for AEW too, but is a trained professional wrestler from Japan. And that's the idea, is like, these are two women that can hit our standard of what we want to see in pro wrestling. Now, have there been women on the independents before that could have hit that PWG standard? I would say there probably were at different times. And now is not like some transformative time where now finally talent is available that can hit that level. But it does show kind of the need for joshi talent in some ways to bring the American women's wrestling scene up a level. If you remember Ring of Honor, when they were relaunching their women's division again, they had a really hard time. And the reason they had a really hard time was for a lot of it, there was just so little. The best women's wrestlers were being signed by WWE. The other best women's wrestlers were now being signed by AEW, who needed to build their own division from scratch. And so you were left with Ring of Honor, this third base promotion, and there just wasn't a lot of available talent at the independent level that Ring of Honor could bring in and count on them to perform at a high level. So they really, they used a lot of joshi talent. They brought in, Mayu Iwatani. They brought in, some different women through Stardom. There was kind of a connection, at least for a little bit there. They had, this is terrible because I can't remember her name. Who was their women's champion for a while? Totally unprepared, as you can see. Susan, this is terrible.
Kelly Klein?
No, not Kelly Klein. The joshi talent. This is awful. This is terrible audio. I'm sorry, everybody. I had this point all lined up, but I could not remember. I cannot remember who it was. I've got, it was Sumi Sakai. That's who I was thinking of. Sumi Sakai. Yep. So, she was the champion for a long time and kind of was like their inaugural champion, and she held it for, I think, like almost a year. It says 251 days here. And, that was what they were kind of doing to try to kind of get their division off the ground. And so that kind of shows an overall just the general importance. And it's really good for the American women's independent scene to have these joshi talent in, and for, someone like Masha Slamovich to wrestle, Yuka Sakazaki, and for, Miyu Yamashita to be coming to the United States and be wrestling a lot of different American independent women. It's really good for that talent to be able to work with someone as experienced and as talented as Yamashita is. and just that kind of goes across the board, and is really important. Because a lot of the, Yamashita's doing some mixed gender matches, and that's fine, but I also think it's a kind of a wasted opportunity to have, like, you're bringing in some really talented women, like, let's use them to elevate the women that we have, as opposed to, like, yeah, they're going to wrestle, I don't know, like, Titus Alexander, or someone who's already pretty good and, is wrestling Will Ospreay and already top tier talent. But that's what I see. But we're seeing there's interest there from the American public. There's interest there in seeing someone like Yamashita. And I don't think that really existed even during the tape trading days. Like, I don't think Manami Toyota ever did a US tour. Maybe she did and I was wrong, but it just seems like there's a new interest level there for Joshi talent across the board on the American independents.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see. I believe from the story, it like Pro Wrestling Revolution is this promotion that's associated with the clothing company, or like apparel company Mass Republic, and they're the ones who are responsible for applying for visas for Dragon Gate and Noah talents. And so I'm very curious to see like what the sort of demand is for the wrestlers from those promotions and who they're going to bring in. I think there's speculation that like they have like a big show called King of the Indies, which is around like the fall or so. Obviously, I think they're going to like maybe they'll bring them in for like during the summer, but I'm sure like maybe if it succeeds, they'll bring it on for their big show there. But still, like Noah right now, it's mostly, especially like the championship scene, it's filled with a lot of people past their primes. The Fujitas, obviously Muto's hurt, but he was the champion before. And so even for Dragon Gate, like they have a lot of great talent, but I'm not sure how large that audience is to actually pay tickets to go to these shows with Dragon Gate talent. So I'm very curious to see what the demand is for the Noah and Dragon Gate wrestlers.
Yeah, we mentioned that, like the visas and getting more of the talent in, your high level, presumably your high level New Japan or Dragon Gate talent, your high level Noah talent, high level DDT talent, whoever really wants to come in. We've seen some of them come to the United States. Obviously, the visa issue becomes kind of complicated. Part of that is obviously, I think, like Dragon Gate is a popular promotion in Japan. People that around here that watch it tend to really like it and always want to talk about it. But does it have that high of a profile in the United States? I don't know. Like, I don't think Miyu Yamashita had a lot of high profile in the United States, but yet she's being brought in and she's wrestling all over the place. So I think part of it is just that a lot of people will just, even if they're not super familiar with a Japanese talent, if they're being told, we're bringing this person in from Japan, they're really good, they will get excited for them regardless of if they're really that familiar with it. If someone brings in a Shun Skywalker or a Naruki Doi, and someone's like, oh yeah, they're Dragon Gate, champion ace kind of guy, and like everyone's like, oh yeah, okay, I'll be excited for this, because there are some people that come over from Japan who aren't very good, but for the most part, it's the top talent, some of the best wrestlers in the world that are coming over, and so fans maybe who aren't familiar with them still associate that with high quality and will get excited about it, even if they're not like huge particular fans of the individual talent.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess like I guess the one negative is that most people associate Dragon Gate with Akira Tozawa, who obviously in WWE is not doing nowhere near close to work that he's capable of, just running around with our truth with 24/7 division. But still, I think once you convince, I think it could take easy convincing to have people, hey, watch this clip of from this match, and so you get a couple hundred people to sign on. And it's very similar to I was reading about this, like Mass Republic, they got visas also for Mexican talents, and I didn't know who Aramis was, or Ares, and these guys are fantastic wrestlers, it turns out. And so I guess this is the move that they're trying to mirror. Same thing with the luchadors that they brought in, and so I think that's fairly successful. I mean, those guys are fairly consistently booked on the indies and have a decent following. And so I think it can mirror that kind of move, and I think it could be successful for them this time around as well.
Yeah, I think with like Dragon Gate and like Tozawa, I think like the people who know that Akira Tozawa was in Dragon Gate are people who will be able to in general be able to understand like WWE is not using Akira Tozawa correctly, and that like their utilization of him is not a indictment or indicator of what Dragon Gate wrestling is like. I wonder, like, if you market it as like Dragon Gate Pro Wrestling is coming, stars of Dragon Gate are coming to the US. Like, they're the promotion that produced WWE superstar Akira Tozawa, or just Tozawa. Like, maybe that is different because you're usually like, you're like being like, yeah, it's where this WWE guy came from. And people only know WWE, like, well, that guy kind of sucks. He'll, maybe that wouldn't work out as well. But I think in general, like, the Dragon Gate guys, yeah, definitely. And Dragon Gate did have Dragon Gate USA. And so a lot of the older Dragon Gate guys that are still around, people like Naruki Doi and people like Genki Horiguchi, those guys like know, maybe have some familiarity with US indie scene, and people will remember them from Dragon Gate USA. Or there's obviously the famous Ring of Honor match when Ring of Honor worked with Dragon Gate, the Do Fixer versus Blood Generation 6-man tag at WrestleMania weekend. That was like kind of the first crazy Dragon Gate 6-man that happened in the United States, and had a really big influence on the kind of rapid style tag wrestling that every indie promotion has. Every indie promotion has at least one match on every card that is basically trying to do Fixer versus Blood Generation with just the crazy tags and tons of high spots and all that. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing. I mean, the thing with Dragon Gate is that they tour a lot. I haven't looked at them like this year, but Dragon Gate runs like 150 to 180 shows a year. At least that's what they were doing before the pandemic. It's possible they slowed down in relation to the pandemic, but they're a major promotion that runs a ton. And so like, it's kind of weird. I don't know, like what kind of talent is going to be made available from Dragon Gate. We still haven't really seen that much from this pro wrestling revolution story about like, are we talking Shun Skywalker? Are we talking, their top stars, the people that they're really counting on? Or are we talking about maybe some younger wrestlers, maybe like La Estrella is coming into the United States, and those are the kind of people that we're going to get. Similar to how New Japan does, like, right? Like Okada and Tanahashi aren't always working US indies because they need them in Japan because they're running all the time. And what the people who come to the United States are, either young boys or guys who are retired, or not retired, but guys who are clearly in the back half of their careers that aren't necessarily needed. People like, Nagata and Suzuki and that kind of end of it. So it'll be interesting to see if they get on. We haven't really seen any promotion outside of New Japan try to run in the United States, like outright run a show in the United States. I kind of think that we sometimes during WrestleMania weekend, I think like they've I think DG has tried stuff during WrestleMania weekend. I think Stardom has done shows during WrestleMania weekend. I think like kind of independent of that would be interesting thing. I think Stardom, I don't know economically if they can make sense, but I think that Stardom could draw well if they produced like a show in Chicago or New York City or LA. If they wanted to try that, I don't know if they will, but
yeah, I think that's the big thing in that regard, is that like what kind of audience can they get outside of WrestleMania weekend, or outside like a Double or Nothing weekend or All Out weekend, right? Like, they are smart in that they know when to run when these big events are happening, where most wrestling fans will probably be. But like, say like in the middle of June or something like that, or the middle of October, like, could they do something big like that and run a show? Like, I have no idea. Again, I agree with you that Stardom is probably the best candidate to actually do well if they run their own show. Again, for Dragon Gate, for example, I have no idea, especially if they don't bring in like your top guys, especially your top champion. Like, I think Kai is the champion right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, if they don't bring him and they just bring in, like the other like under people in the factions, like that's probably not going to draw well.
It's just like Punch Tommy Naga and
BB,
Stalker Ichikawa,
yeah,
and
exactly.
like, you know, like the low level guys in the company. Um, you know, it's one of those things that maybe they don't, but yeah, you know, I don't know, maybe those are kind of, we don't know what their scale is. The only one I feel like we have any idea on like how popular the brand is in Japan, in the United States, is New Japan, because they run all the time. I think what we're seeing, I think with some of this talent coming over, a lot of it is kind of, it's really interesting. So you mentioned like the Noah shows, right? The Noah Ring of Honor shows from the mid 2000s that were kind of catered towards tape traders, right? We're bringing in Kento Kobashi, and we're going to bring in Mitsuharu Musawa. And these are going to be wrestlers that are legends, that the very core, the hardest of hardcore tape trading fans have probably, you know, some of them maybe saw them in Japan, but have been watching it about, you know, for 15 years, and are now going to get to see them wrestle live and in person. And it was such a niche audience, you know, like you know, you get like 1,200 people driving to these shows, but these were these huge legends. And so in that end, it's kind of like you're not introducing talent to a new market when you're bringing in those guys. I think like Suzuki is a really interesting example, because I think that Suzuki has a following of fans in the United States that never watched a New Japan show before they saw Minoru Suzuki, and never got, you know, were never really invested in New Japan at all. Maybe still don't, but he's now a popular American independent wrestler, almost removed from his, you know, entire career in Japan. Which, you know, is a testament to his ability to be able to get over with various audiences, and his character translating across culture and across language. So you don't need to be told about, you know, how great he is, and you don't have to have these decades of fond memories of Minoru Suzuki to be interested in him. You see him once and you're like, yeah, Minoru Suzuki, the murder grandpa. Like, I'm happy he's coming to the United States. And I think that that's a really interesting shift, in the sense that Japanese talent, fans are now much more, seems like, accepting of Japanese talent coming in and expecting them to be good and being interested in them, without necessarily having any prior relationship with them in their Japanese careers.
Yeah, I mean, Suzuki caters to, you know, the shoot style wrestling audience who enjoy that type of wrestling. Like, he's also a fantastic comedy wrestler as well. Like, I remember, I still can't get over that Minoru Suzuki was going to come to WrestleMania weekend and face Orange Cassidy, and we never got that because of the pandemic. And, you know, it would have been awesome because of those dynamics of those characters. And, you know, I think everyone else is looking forward to that as well. And, you know, he does all his greatest hits, and it still translates. It's still over with every audience, any promotion. And you're right, it is very different compared before. Like, I remember when Tajiri was in WWE, like if Tajiri debuted now, his debut would be much more different than it was back then, because like back then it wasn't really treated as with any reverence or anything like that. You know, nowadays, you know, when big wrestler comes in, even like someone Kojima would debut, like there's the reverence towards his career and such. Even Nagata as well. You know, these guys who are, you know, the dads in New Japan, but, you know, are treated as big deals here in America. It's very different attitudes when these older Japanese wrestlers, you know, sort of come into different promotions.
Yeah, well, think about, like, you know, Taka Michinoku and how he was, you know,
Yep.
WWE goes out, WWE's mad that WCW has this international cruiserweight division. So they say, we're going to start our own cruiserweight division. Let's go find someone who's an international star that would fit it. They go and get Taka Michinoku, who was, I'm not super familiar with like the hierarchy of Michinoku Pro in the mid 2000s, other people or mid 1990s, but Taka Michinoku was seen as like this young, up and coming big star in the making. And so WWE is like, yeah, let's go bring in this guy, and he's perfect. But the way that fan base at the time was never going to get into a smaller Japanese wrestler. They've been conditioned a certain way to disregard certain talents and to not care about someone that they haven't seen hype, they haven't seen a bunch of times before and isn't connected to a previous era. Didn't matter the vignettes, how many vignettes they put out about Taka is coming. Didn't matter how many good, like cool matches he actually had and did a bunch of crazy athletic stuff that no one else in the company was doing at the time. It was all about, Steve Austin and Shawn Michaels and DX and The Rock. And that fan base, though, the fan base today is so different than that fan base, especially if you're talking like an AEW, where the fan base is just way more accepting of Japanese talent and has a more, like, I also like, has a more open mind towards who can be good, as opposed to, I feel like, your typical WWE fan, especially your WWE fan from a few decades ago, where it was very close-minded on, who can be a star. And that to me is a big difference, especially when you see that trickle down towards all facets of wrestling, including the independents, where, yeah, it's like Minoru Suzuki, like, is this guy who's like not really that big, like physically,
Yep.
and he looks old, and he's like, I feel like if you were to dump him out in a previous era, people would be like, who the hell is this guy? He's like, why we're supposed to be afraid of this 5'10", 200-pound, 50-year-old man. Like, but the wrestling fan base now is like, oh yeah, it's Minoru Suzuki. He's a killer from Japan. And then he beats people up, and, his performance is so good that it matches his persona. So people, buy into it that way. But I think people are way more open-minded, at least certain segments of the fan base are way more open-minded about who could be successful and who they see as potential stars. And that's aided a lot of these Japanese talents in being able to get over at that kind of grassroots level without any prior real history or connections.
Yeah, I think that just kind of goes with an overall cultural shift, at least in sports. Like Steph Curry, he is, I think back in the day, if you're a small point guard, he's not looking small any means. I think he's like 6'2", 6'3", but still, like, for point guards, you're just told to pass the ball to the center and, just play defense. But for Steph, he's the best player in the league. He's one of the best players in the league, and he's just shooting. He's revolutionized 3-point shooting, and I don't think, back in the day, guys like Shaq and, Patrick Ewing and, of course there was Jordan, but still, like, it was mostly the big mans who were the best players in basketball. And, I think part of that cultural shift is, we're exposed to, different players of different sizes can be, succeed in different leagues. And I think, like you said, the wrestling fan base outside of the WWE core fan base is more open-minded and, more accepting to different styles of wrestling. And, that's why I'm very curious about, Great O'Khan debuting in AEW. Like, he is very, I'm a big fan of his, but I understand that a lot of people are not fans of his for various different reasons. I acknowledge those reasons, but still, like, I'm very curious to see how the AEW audience reacts to, not only his character, but also his wrestling style as well, because that's going to be an interesting hurdle, especially as I'm presuming, like, he and Jeff Cobb will be on the Forbidden Door show against FTR, based on the angle of this previous Dynamite.
Yeah, so Khan shows up, with Jeff Cobb as like a total surprise, appearance on Dynamite on Wednesday. And I actually think he's a really interesting case point for, like, what does the AEW audience and kind of the broader non-WWE wrestling audience accept with Japanese talent showing up. And I would say that most fans in attendance, not most, but maybe, like, let's say, it's kind of hard to tell, because that was also an unusual crowd in the sense that they're in Las Vegas for this whole week. A lot of people at that Dynamite are like your most hardcore AEW fans who are watching all of the shows this weekend. So maybe that's not like a typical AEW crowd, but just in general, I would say, like, a lot of people didn't know who Great O'Khan was. I'm pretty sure Jim Ross didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
But he showed up, and they know Jeff Cobb, who's not an AEW regular by any means, but had been on AEW television before, and, was a known independent guy and a known guy before. So Jeff Cobb shows up, and he's got O'Khan with him because they're a tag team in Japan as part of the United Empire. And I think the general fan base, they're not like, you know, remember when Satnam Singh debuted and everyone was like, who
Yeah,
are you? Who are you? Like no heat, just like total confusion over who this guy was. And it was because no one knew who Satnam Singh was, or I actually did know who he was, but like unless you were like following like who was training at the Nightmare Academy or was a fan of the like 2015 NBA draft, like you probably
exactly.
wouldn't know who he was,
Yeah,
or expect him to show up on television. But he but like that was kind of like a bad, that's a bad debut. I think there's no denying it because the crowd just didn't know who he was. Well, Khan comes out, and of course he's with Cobb, who people know, but and I'm not going to say like the crowd went crazy for Okan, but people kind of, you could tell like people just accepted like, okay, here's Jeff Cobb. He's here with this other kind of big dude, and they're tossing these guys around, and he's slamming Trent through a table, and people are just accepting like, okay, there's this team, they're from New Japan Pro Wrestling, he's got a good look, you know, I just accept that he's some tough guy and we should be scared of him. Like, I think the fan base is that. I'm not going to say he's just going to get super over or he's going to be, this massive star right away, or he's going to be like a Minoru Suzuki like figure who everyone ends up be loving. But he has established a level of credibility. And I think that comes from a history of kind of educating the fans about Japanese talent comes into AEW is going to be taken seriously and is not going to be someone who's going to be given a stereotypical gimmick or someone who's going to be jobbed out all the time. It's going to be something where we're taking these guys seriously. And if this guy shows up and he's a Japanese talent, like you should take him as the same amount of face value as you would if an American talent showed up that you did recognize. And with him, as a performer, he has like two different people he can be. He can be heavy into his gimmick where he's doing like the claw and he's doing like the weird he's doing the Mongolian chops and he's kind of doing his shtick and he's kind of doing this like outdated Killer Khan 70s wrestling heel gimmick that I don't think that's going to get over. But he also just has, in his bag, like big, husk guy that tosses people around. And I think that's what he's going to do in AEW. And I see that getting over. Like if he's going to go full on, you can usually tell by if he's wearing like the Mongolian tights,
yep,
like you're getting gimmick Okan, like more gimmicky Okan. If you're getting like normal wrestling tights, which is what he was wearing on Wednesday, you're getting like more traditional, style wrestler Okan. And I think that's probably what he's going to do because that's going to play more towards the American audience. And you're teaming with Jeff Cobb, just wrestle Jeff Cobb style, and you'll be two guys tossing people around. I think that's the safest way to go, and that's what I think he's going to do. I don't think they're going to lean too hard into like the Okan character that they're really trying to get over.
yeah, for sure. I 100% agree. I'm sure Jeff Cobb probably told him that as well. Having worked a long time in the Indies, he probably just told him like, hey, like this is what you should do. Avoid this. Keep that for the certain other audiences. Maybe if you're wrestling Danhausen, maybe you can do that. But still, like he probably told him like just do what I do and just wrestle it straight and we'll be okay. And I think it did provide a good first impression for the Forbidden Door card. At least we'll probably get some sort of tag team championship match. But again, I think we talked about this in our last episode about how we don't really know what this card is going to look like. When will Okada and Tanahashi be next to come out? Obviously, like we'll probably have to wait after Double or Nothing to see what happens after that. To see the fallout from that, at least, will someone show up at Double or Nothing? I think AEW has create a precedence that something big happens at these pay-per-views in terms of a big appearance, whether it is a new wrestler, a returning wrestler, or etc. And so there's going to be a lot of expectations. And if they well, I wouldn't say it's a bad thing if they don't deliver on that, but at least deliver something. Whether it is just a video, like a promo video, perhaps. I think people will be at least somewhat satisfied with that in terms of the build to Forbidden Door.
Yeah, I would expect someone to show up, and with that audience, like if Okada shows up or Tanahashi shows up or one of the big stars shows up, like say, if the show goes off the air and like Hangman Page or CM Punk, whoever is the world champion at the end of the show, has the title, like an Okada comes out, like the fans that are going to be at that show are going to go crazy, and they're going to treat Okada like he was, Bryan Danielson or Adam Cole or one of the other guys who kind of debuted at a big pay-per-view show. So I totally think that can happen. I mean, we talked about this a few weeks ago, like because the Best of Super Juniors is going on in Japan right now, Okada and Tanahashi and Naito and, I was going to say Ibushi, but that's a separate story. Like those guys aren't working right now. So those guys can be in America right this second. I have no idea. To show up, I expect there to be some teases at Double or Nothing. And we already got one. Obviously, it looks like FTR versus Cobb and Khan is going to be a program going forward. And, it kind of is interesting thing. We talked a lot about the casual fan and Forbidden Door and, like what is that company's appeal to, what is the appeal of the New Japan AEW Super Show to somebody who doesn't have a lot of familiarity with New Japan Pro Wrestling? And that'll be ultimately like a really big test for kind of what we're talking about here, which is the fans' ability to appreciate, the fans' ability to be able to appreciate a talent that they maybe are unfamiliar with, but because they have learned to accept Japanese talent as potential top stars, if the company promotes them as such, they will feel that way and that kind of trust. And I think that'll be a big kind of case study in seeing if we do see people like Okada and Tanahashi on these, regular Dynamites or Rampages leading up to Forbidden Door, what kind of those reactions are going to be like from the fans? Will fans treat them like a big star? Will they kind of be, mild? Will they say, I don't know who this is. I'm very confused. This is bad, which I don't think they're going to do that, but it'll be interesting to see kind of over the next month or so how that happens, because it's ultimately like the biggest case study we have for the very thing that we're talking about, which is kind of has that acceptance moved, and has the fan base been educated enough to kind of do a big show like that and have kind of your typical AEW viewer view it as a big deal and not just your super hardcore fan.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's going to be like, oh, this was confusing, so it's bad. I think people will just be like, oh, this was confusing, I'll just move on with my life. I think that's that's the worst reaction you're going to get, which is obviously not good, but still, like, it's not going to be devastating. You'll just be like, oh, well, I'll just move on to the next angle or whatever. And so obviously you would want people to be interested, but I think that's the worst reaction you're going to get. And I think another interesting case study is that with Wheeler Yuta in the Best of the Super Juniors, will he be on the Forbidden Door card? I remember, I think when he lost to El Desperado, he's like, oh, El Desperado, I owe you a pure championship match because I lost to you. And so, like, will they pay that off at Forbidden Door? Perhaps, is El Desperado a big enough name to warrant a singles match with Wheeler Yuta, who I don't believe they mentioned it on television at all where Wheeler Yuta has actually been. And so I guess, they don't have to, I guess. I think they probably just,
I think they have.
Really?
I think Excalibur has said that. I think they said it. Maybe they even said it before you even left.
Oh, okay.
Where like they're like, Wheeler Yuta going to be competing in the Best of Super Juniors. I feel like I've heard that. It's possible that I'm wrong, but they're not showing highlight packages on Dynamite of his exploits, which I would I would want them to do personally. But
yeah, I think that this may be like, that will be just an interesting thing to do if they were to do that, to say, hey, this is what Wheeler Yuta's doing. It's a build up to either a singles match with an El Desperado. He's lost to Robbie Eagles as well. And so maybe he'd have a match with Robbie Eagles at Forbidden Door as well. But still, like, it would be interesting to weave a storyline from what your wrestler is doing another promotion into this big super show. I think that would be very interesting to do. I don't know if they're actually going to do that, since like, Yuta is like the Ring of Honor champion and not AEW champion. So again, we don't really know like what the distinction will be between Ring of Honor and AEW just yet. We have hints of it, but still nothing like clear and obvious.
Yeah, I think Desperado versus Wheeler Yuta is a likely match for Forbidden Door at that point if they want to do it. I mean, Desperado is maybe not super popular in the United States, but over the last year or so, he's been elevated to being like close to the top junior level. I think in Japan, I think Hiromu is always going to be viewed for as long as he's in that division as like the ace of the junior heavyweight division for New Japan. But Desperado, I would say, is probably number 2 at this point. You know, he's had multiple, you know, junior heavyweight title reigns. He's protected pretty well within that division. So he would be like a kind of guy you could throw out there with Wheeler Yuta. So that I think is a good point. I mean, yeah, the Ring of Honor, like, okay, he's the Ring of Honor champion. You're going to have that title defended. And, you know, well, FTR are the Ring of Honor tag champions. And that seems like the titles that are going to be on the line. On that, you know, I think Brian Alvarez said something like he was kind of just hypothetically talking about that. And he said, like, it would be something if FTR were able to win the IWGP tag titles sometime between now and Forbidden Door. And then they could defend those against Cobb and Okan, who would want to, you know, who kind of lost the titles like in a fluke triple threat kind of way.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think like Chase Owens and Fale, I think, are the champions. Like, you could easily have FTR beat those guys and then face off, you know, with, oh, we got your title belts, don't you want them? Which is kind of the story that FTR did with the Young Bucks, which is like the FTR won the tag titles before the Young Bucks did in AEW, and AEW kind of had to beat them before they could get them, or the Young Bucks had to beat FTR to beat them before they could get them. I want to talk about like another guy who I think is an interesting case study is, you know, Konosuke Takeshita, so Takeshita comes, really interesting kind of thing that's going on with him. Takeshita is the top star in DDT. He's won their version of the world championship multiple times. He's really young. He's only 26, but his whole kind of gimmick was that he was like 20 and he was already a main eventer for DDT. So he's already had this kind of long career as a top guy in DDT, and he's still really young. And so they came up, I don't know whose idea was it? Was it Kenny Omega's? Was it Tony Khan's? Was it Takeshita's? Was it, you know, John Akiyama? Who was it in DDT? You know, was someone in DDT who came up with this idea? Is like, Takeshita's going to go to AEW for a full year and just be an AEW regular guy and learn how to wrestle American style and to wrestle on American television. And he'll come back to DDT. He'll probably be fresher because he wouldn't have been in DDT. I guess he's going to be on some major DDT shows, but I don't think he's been announced for any yet. But the idea is that, like, he's just kind of, he's the ace of DDT, and he's doing this sabbatical in the United States. And he's started off in the US, and he had a couple matches. He had his first kind of, he wrestled on Dark. His first kind of major match was he wrestled Jay Lethal in a pretty good match on Rampage a couple weeks ago. And then last week he wrestles Hangman Page, and he has one of the best matches I've ever seen in AEW, one of the very best matches I've seen, I think, in Dynamite's history with Hangman Page. Just an excellent professional wrestling match. You know, he gets a ton of offense in, he sells a lot, but he goes toe to toe with, you know, the top guy in AEW. And so they kind of, again, it's AEW kind of showing you, like, yeah, this is a random Japanese guy, but he's really good. And here he's going to push our champion pretty hard. But it also kind of sets off a very interesting potential next year for Takeshita, kind of on this excursion in the United States.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what they do with him. He just lost the main title, the KOD Openweight Championship, to Tetsuya Endo, who's another big star for them in DDT. But obviously, like, you know, Takeshita is the main guy, like the feature for the company for them. And so it is pretty, I guess ballsy is the right word, to really just have your main guy take a year off and you know, be away from you. And it does give them an opportunity to potentially use some other younger wrestlers to go up against Endo, to really step up and to really, you know, that's a storyline right there, to really try to take Takeshita's place, you know, and fill in those big shoes there. And, you know, having that fantastic match with Adam Page on Dynamite is a very good first step to show the audience that, like, hey, this guy is a really good wrestler, and, you know, that's what he's going to do. He's going to have really good wrestling matches. You know, how that develops throughout the whole year is going to be a big question. And whether, you know, whether he'll win the TNT championship or something like that is, would be interesting to see, you know, to have a guy who, you know, is, you know, sort of alone and, you know, really prosper for you. It's very much like soccer, when you have the smaller clubs loan their younger players to these bigger clubs, and that potentially helps them out. Hopefully, for DDT, there's not like a sign to buy option, unlike there is in soccer. But it is very good, good win-win potentially for both of these companies.
Yeah, it's like Takeshita's going on an excursion, but he's not a young boy. He's like the star of the company.
Yep.
And it's almost like more like an old territorial thing, which is like, all right, you guys kind of stale up top. Why don't we send you let's send you to Portland and work for Don Owen for a year, and then you'll come back and you'll be fresh with the new feuds and stuff like that. It's really interesting. It's a lot of faith that DDT is showing in Tony Khan and AEW, that like their top guy is going to go to America, and counting on him to be featured, well, which is something that has not happened, a lot in American wrestling. You look at, obviously, like WWE is not going to necessarily treat the talent well. You even look at like how TNA handled things like Okada's young boy excursion, and like those things were, Okada says like, oh yeah, I learned a lot that time period, but it wasn't necessarily like an awesome time for him as a performer, I feel like. And for Takeshita, it's a lot of faith to go forward, and obviously it's off to a really great start. He's this close to inking a Cinnabon endorsement with Cinnabon. For people who don't know, he's been posting a lot on social media about how obsessed he is with Cinnabon, like going there every day. It's very funny. I like to think like the American wrestlers, when they go to Japan, right, they like make a big deal on social media of like assimilating to Japanese culture. Like they'll take a photo of them and they'll be wearing like the robes, and they'll be like at some temple somewhere, or they'll be like doing this like very Japanese thing. And like Takeshita's, comes to America, and what's he going to do? He's going to come obsessed with the fast food restaurants. And I'm waiting for him he's going to go back to DDT, and he's going to be like 275 pounds because all he did was eat Cinnabon every day. But it's just kind of, it's one of the, it's kind of funny to see that happen. But he's off to a great start. It's like, I think now when he goes forward, it'll be interesting to see like what happens to him. Like, is he going to be wrestling regularly on AEW television? Will he, could he be TNT champion one day? I mean, I wouldn't rule that out if he's over, and I feel like he's on the trajectory to get over. He'll be doing quite well. And obviously, things like promos and stuff might be a problem, because I don't know how fluent he is in English or how comfortable he is as a speaker in English. I don't think I've ever heard him talk in English before. We should probably give you that answer, but he definitely seems like he's on track to be somebody in AEW, which is really good. It's really good for him. It's probably really good for DDT, because whenever he's on, the announcers talk about, he's from DDT and these promotions, and that works for them on that end. And I think overall it works. It's helpful to all Japanese talent that wants to come in and work for AEW, because he's setting a standard pretty high right now as a guy on excursion there.
Yeah, it builds good reputation for AEW if they can show that, hey, you can bring your talents over to us and we'll treat them very well. New Japan and TNA/Impact, they had a very rocky relationship because of the way their New Japan talent were treated in TNA, and that only got fixed very recently because of that long grudge that they held of the way they treated Okada, Tanahashi, Sanada, all those guys. And as long as Takeshita makes, it doesn't have to be like very frequently, but at least a couple times a month he gets featured on Dynamite or Rampage. I think that's a success there. If he's just doing dark elevation for long periods of time, I don't really think that's going to help him that much. Obviously, Tony Khan can say whatever he wants about how much he treats dark elevation as priorities. I think the audience understands that, like, hey, these are just fun shows to watch, but they're not by no means a huge priority in terms of required viewing.
Yeah, I mean, with Takeshita, like, I think he's got to win some matches. Like he lost to Jay Lethal. He lost to He lost to Jay Lethal, and they protected him, with that loss. He lost to Hangman Page, who he's never always going to lose to, and that's fine. You can lose to Page. I'd like to see him like on AEW television the next month or so, pick up like wins over, there's plenty of guys in the AEW roster that he could beat. You could have him beat QT Marshall. You could have him beat Matt Sydal. You could have him beat Dante Barton. You could have him beat Lee Moriarty. Like these guys who are different phases of their career who have like some level of credibility. They're not total jobbers, but guys who can lose to Takeshita if you want to do something with Takeshita now, which I think would be wise. But in AEW, they got so many talent that you could push if you wanted to. And obviously not all of them are going to end up getting pushed. I think they're trying as hard as they can, but there's going to be people who are just going to end up not pushed probably to the level of their ability based on the size of the roster and the amount of time that they have to show them. And again, it's good faith in TDT that they're kind of counting on AEW to promote him, because the whole point is that he's coming over here to become a bigger star in America and to kind of learn some American things. And if he was never wrestling and never really pushed, he wouldn't really learn that much. Real quick before we wrap up, do you want to talk at all about like WWE's use of Japanese talent and kind of how that has gone? I think it's kind of, there's nothing really new there as far as like philosophies that have changed. It seems kind of like the same old. Like a lot of these other companies, I'll say that they had, when they wanted to build their women's division, they went to Japan and they tried to find some joshi talent, and they got the best ones. I mean, they got, Asuka, Kana, they got, Io Shirai, who was probably, the ace of Stardom before she decided to depart. Kairi Sane, was obviously well known in Japan. So they went out and they got these people, Sarai, who is in NXT now, was also another what's Sarai's promotion? Was she Marvelous? Or Seedling?
Mostly Diana.
There's so many joshi promotions with so many different names.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember. But yeah, so Sarai was like a real 17, 18-year-old, world champion.
Yep.
But right, they go out and they get the best women's kind of talent. I would say Asuka's been a success. Everything that I think they could have hoped for Asuka, they got out of it. She's a really good wrestler. She got over with the audience on the main roster, despite really not being able to speak English that well. And, they pushed her and protected her for a while. And that's, but Io Shirai seems like she's stuck in she was really good at NXT, and she seems like she's just stuck there. Kairi Sane, I think, unfortunately came along when kind of at a bad time, when kind of, Asuka had kind of lost some momentum on the main roster, and Kairi Sane kind of got sucked into this repackaging of Asuka, which didn't help her out at all. And Sarai just seems, unfortunately, like DOA, because the way that NXT has changed and kind of the kind of gimmicks they feel like they have to give to everyone. But it's been interesting how they've used their women's talent from Japan.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you got Shinsuke Nakamura as well. He has reached levels of being the upper mid card, but WWE has been pretty much unwilling to go beyond that. He'll get hot in a program, and then go face to face with a guy like Roman Reigns, but he'll never actually win that big match there. And so he's just kind of stuck in that mid card sort of level. The partnership with Rick Boogs was fun. But unfortunately, Boogs is hurt right now. And so it's just kind of Shinsuke by himself. And, he's just kind of in that sort of middle atmosphere. People have joked that, I mean, it's kind of a joke, but it's also kind of true as well. It's kind of a retirement tour for Shinsuke in WWE as his career is closing down. And so it's been kind of mixed results for Shinsuke. But obviously, compared to NXT, I think people will consider that the peak of his WWE career.
Yeah, Shinsuke is a weird one, because I think that there's a lot of disappointment in how he's currently used, and kind of feel like he's been lazy and he's been on cruise control, and he's just happy to surf and live in Florida. And
exactly.
He's just happy with his life. And I'm sure he doesn't view his run in WWE as a mistake, and other people do. I don't know. I feel like, he, in a lot of ways, he's been very successful in WWE. He hasn't been completely buried in has no credibility at all. He's had times of competency. He won the Royal Rumble. He was obviously treated as a really big deal in NXT. I think there's a world exists where he's like a legit top main event guy still in WWE, and he's a bigger star than he is now. But all in all, given that he was already, kind of banged up when he got signed by WWE, and his career was probably starting to trend downwards anyway. You look at the run that he's had, it's a low bar to clear, but they didn't change his name. They didn't really change his gimmick that much or his personality. He's still Shinsuke Nakamura. You can still see the same kind of performer that he was in WWE, or when he was in New Japan. Just the company around him is less competent at promoting him as a top star. But he's still kind of like, he's not like been just totally reduced to nothing the way like Akira Tozawa has.
Yeah.
Which is like, nothing is the same from this guy that he was in his peak in Dragon Gate. This guy has so much to offer, and he's barely allowed to even wrestle. Like, he's running around in this ninja gimmick. Like, that to me is like, okay, this is a disaster for this guy. And Nakamura just kind of seems like, this is the downside of it. He's kind of on the back half of his career, and this is kind of what it looks like. And he's getting paid a lot of money, and this is how he's kind of like, I don't know if his career would be like at this point, like if he went back to New Japan, I don't know, like he'd be a bigger star, and he'd be presented as more credible as opposed to being like punked out by Roman Reigns. But he wouldn't, I don't think he'd be a top guy anymore in New Japan. Or he certainly wouldn't be like, Okada, Tanahashi, and Nakamura. It would be like, he'd be further down on the list for sure. But I don't think he's had a really interesting career just in general. If you just look at, his original push in New Japan and how long it took him to actually get over as top star, and kind of it helps put his WWE run in a little bit of perspective as well. Just a strange career overall. I don't really know. I think there's a lot of arguments that can be had about like how effective he was overall, and if he reached his potential as a star, just in totality.
Yeah, you could definitely go either way on that. I think interesting is probably the best way to put it. And I think, even Kushida was on that Nakamura path for a bit, for his early days in NXT, he was treated as a big star, and, they didn't really change much of his gimmick, except for, the very direct Back to the Future references. I think they're still there, but, they weren't as direct as they were before. But, I think it's just timing with Kushida, because the NXT eventually became NXT 2.0, and he was an older star, and that's why they eventually let him go from there. And same thing with Sarai. She was, I don't know if she officially signed, but I remember there were talks of her signing before the pandemic, but then the pandemic hit, and that's why her appearance in NXT was delayed as much as it was, and so it was just bad timing for her. She's obviously very young, and so I'm sure that's why they're still keeping her around. But they got her with some magical girl Sailor Moon gimmick, which is half-assed pretty much. Like, if you want to do that, like I saw her entrance, like there's like some B-roll footage of her walking backstage, and then like they cut to the actual entrance, and she's just changed into her wrestling gear away from like a schoolgirl uniform, and it's just like, it's so half-assed, but like that's what they're going with for a gimmick, because it's NXT 2.0 and it's a colorful gimmick. That's what they're going with for her, and so she's making the best of it as much as she can.
Yeah, I mean, that's I don't know. Do you want to talk about Ike Manjiro?
I mean, there's not really much to say, is there?
Yeah, other than it was inexplicable that him and Hideki Suzuki, like, kind of like inexplicably that they were signed in the first place. Like, okay,
Yeah.
Shinsuke Nakamura, all right, obviously you sign him, big huge star in New Japan. Kushida, top junior heavyweight in New Japan, sure. Yoshirai, Asuka, Sarai, all top women wrestlers in Japan when they come over.
Yeah.
And then Ike Manjiro, who's just this like gimmick indie Japanese wrestler, somehow is still in WWE. He found his way to WWE, and he's hung around for a while. I think with the Japanese talent WWE, they are all victims of generally Vince McMahon's creative approach to talent, which is he wants all of them to have some sort of personality, but all of their personalities, if you're in Vince McMahon's eyes, your personality is usually boiled down to like the first thing he thinks about when he sees you or thinks of you. And so what ends up happening with basically all foreign talent, and Japanese talent is probably maybe the most obvious example, but you can look at any talent from any country that they get that's not the United States. When Vince wants to give them a new character, it's always some sort of stereotype related to their country, or they're just encouraged to become more foreign because Vince sees them as foreigners and wants them to be just really foreign. Like every British wrestler eventually ends up becoming like a tea drinking snob, British person, or someone who thinks they're royalty, who thinks they're a king, because ultimately Vince doesn't see them as like this, dynamic performer. He sees them as this person who's different than him, and therefore this is what makes you different, and therefore it is going to be played up. When Drew McIntyre, when he was getting frustrated with Drew McIntyre's run as top, Drew McIntyre had to become more Scottish. He had to paint his face and tell long folk stories and carry a sword and pretend like he was in Braveheart all the time. And that's just how he views things. So I think a lot of the Japanese wrestlers get caught up on it. He was like, I don't really get this Asuka person. Like, let's make her the Kabuki Warriors. Yeah, like that. Like, Sarai. She's got to be a schoolgirl. Yeah. Like these kind of really outdated, oftentimes offensive tropes. Even
Io Shirai, Japanese people eat sushi. That's weird. As if there's a sushi restaurant in every big city.
There's a sushi restaurant like every town in America.
Exactly. But raw fish, oh my god, that's so weird.
Yeah, no, it's just it's one of those, and it's not even limited to like foreign talent. Like Chad Gable, like Vince thinks he's short and he's a nerd. So when Chad Gable needs a new character, it's going to be that he's short or that he's a nerd or both. And that's just how he sees people. And like, unfortunately, Japanese talent, because the cultural differences are going to be, so pronounced, they just essentially have no chance at getting over. And it's too bad, because I think as we're seeing in AEW, you can take someone like, Konosuke Takeshita, who has no familiarity with the audience, and if you just kind of like let them be good at their job, they will get over with the fans, or they won't, and you move on from them. Like there's nothing wrong with trying to get, pushing someone, in good faith, and if they don't get over, pulling the plug. A lot of time in WWE, it's like, we're going to push them with this like offensive gimmick that obviously isn't going to work. And I think that's the kind of hindrance for basically all Japanese talent in WWE. There's a long history of this talent being mismanaged.
Even like in AEW, the Japanese talent they have on the roster right now, Hikaru Shida and Riho, they didn't go through any dramatic gimmick changes. If they did, like Hikaru Shida, like her character has changed, in a natural progression, especially through the Serena Deeb feud. Like it's been a very natural progression. It makes sense for a character, and I'm sure, like she's had some say where her character will be and the changes she's made to any sort of thing that she's done. And so, like, you do see that, like, hey, you don't have to resort to offensive stereotypes for your Japanese talent or foreign talent in general. Like, you can just let them have focus on their own characters and have things progress as their feud progresses, or depending on the match results as well.
I think it's at least at the surface level, the talent is being treated the same way any other talent would be. It doesn't really matter that they're from Japan. Now, obviously, there's more nuance to that. You can say there's a language barrier that maybe prevents them from being pushed the way maybe they should be because of concern about promos and that kind of thing. But in general, just, the way WWE sees things, and it's why I don't think that WWE will never be able to land that big Latino American superstar that they've been trying to get for the last 15 years. Because ultimately Vince's idea of how to get them over is like, make them really Mexican, like just talk about being from Mexico and, talk about Mexico all the time and say some words in Spanish. And it's like, no, like to me, at least, it's like, you'd have better luck, presenting a talent that happens to be Hispanic but also like they're treated like a regular talent and they're not seen as like this token person they're presenting. I would point to kind of how Thunder Rosa is presented, where it's like, being Mexican is part of her personality and part of her character, but it's not like, she's not like Viva la Mexico, like during every promo and the kind of the kind of stuff that you would see in WWE. Like there's no way WWE would handle Thunder Rosa and not try to do that. Like zero chance. And that's kind of the way things go. That's pretty much all I got for today. You got anything else that we didn't get to?
No, that's pretty much it. Hopefully, more Okan on Dynamites is what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, we'll definitely, be able to take what we get from what we talked about today and see how that's going to shape out over the next month or so, because we're going to, like I said, that Forbidden Door show is going to be a big test. And, as the, the visas come in and the borders continue to open up and the quarantines are reduced in travel between the Japan and the US, I expect this to be a continuing trend. I expect to see more guys and women on the talents, showing up in the United States, at every level on major promotions and very small promotions. So it's an exciting time. I feel like Japanese pro wrestling. It's definitely a chance to see talent that you would think you'd have to go to Japan to see are now showing up pretty regularly, if you live in the United States. So it's a pretty cool time. And so we'll see you guys again next time.